Thanks for joining us today for the panel. When it comes to culture, ignorance is not bliss, it's risk. My name is Daniel Diermeyer. I'm the Chancellor of Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee in the United States. And I'm joined today by my colleagues from Russell Reynolds Associates, both of whom I've worked with on research and IP around the organizational culture analysis. Anthony Abatiello leads the global leadership and succession sector, and Jamie Hettinger leads the global social justice practice for Russell Reynolds. So I'm going to have a few questions for Anthony and Jamie, and I'm just going to direct them to each of you. Anthony, let's start with you. Culture is a vague term and has been defined very differently by scholars and practitioners. So what are you talking about when you talk about culture?
Thanks, Daniel. Great to be here. We define culture at Russell Reynolds is really about the mindsets, beliefs, and behaviors that need to exist for your organization to achieve its strategy. So simply put, your culture is really the enabler of behavior that allows the organization to follow and perform the way we need to within the organization. That said, understanding those underlying beliefs and behaviors within the organization is often times where there are many issues and obstacles for chief executives and management teams today to really understand how to navigate to the future.
Thank you. My next question is for Jamie. Jamie, why is focusing on culture so important? And what should companies be aware of as the main challenges when it comes to culture?
Thank you, Daniel. Focusing on culture, we are finding, is becoming increasingly important as it's one of the dimensions on which success of an organization can be based. We used to think about and talk about culture as sort of a soft element of an organization, and it recently, I think we all have seen, has become a core dimension to ensuring companies can get things right and can manage avoiding putting organizations and companies in undue risk. So focusing on culture enables companies to understand how to devote time and resources to advance their strategy, equips and activates what we believe to be the most important lever of culture, which is leadership, and helps provide confidence related to strategy execution, human capital outcomes by proactively managing culture risks and opportunities.
Anthony, let me follow up on that theme on culture and strategy. Getting the culture right is often presented as an opportunity to affect the company's ability to execute its long-term strategy. So what does getting the culture right mean more specifically? And then how exactly is it linked to strategy execution?
Yeah, and Daniel, you know this as well as most, having studied this alongside. I think that getting culture right means ensuring there's alignment around what the organizational culture is and how it manifests itself. So aligned cultures are characterized by directly linking beliefs, behaviors, and actions to strategy and leaders that are consistently living the change they want to see in the business and driving that unification around the business. So questions such as how much the leader's behaviors reflect what is important to everybody, how observable behaviors and attitudes reflect the espoused culture, and the extent to which people in the organization live, practice, and experience what is valued become important to understand in cultural alignment. And I'd say to really ensure that there is alignment between culture and strategy, what that actually means, the first is focusing on attributes that are distinctive to the organization's DNA, right? So many organizations think that values and mugs and placards are actually what the espoused culture is. And really it's those distinctive attributes that make us who we are as an organization. The second is that enabling the strategic aspirations of the organization. So, if we want to be innovative, that we're enabling creativity and new idea generation, that we can attract and retain diverse talent, so that diversity and that inclusion of diverse talent allows us to have diversity of thought and experience mixed into the culture. And when we really are aligned, we can promote sustainable performance of the organization, because the the actions and the behaviors of senior leaders are then emulated by the rest of the organization. And we build this muscle and strength of the organizational culture to drive the strategy and ultimately the bottom line performance of the organization.
Well, thank you, Anthony. Jamie, if culture is so important, how do we really get reliable information, measurements, and assessments? I think one of the concerns is often that we're worried that people, tell us, what they think management wants to hear. So how do you get people to tell you what they really think versus what they think you want to hear?
Daniel, we so agree. And I think all of us have seen that traditionally companies are getting information about their culture through traditional culture surveys or even engagement surveys. And we would agree that normally that information can be biased or even tainted. People don't trust that their opinions will actually be confidential, that their answers truly cannot be traced back to them. And with that fear of retaliation, people tend to respond much more favorably than they would if they were promised and delivered a completely anonymized experience. But to do this, we have to create psychological safety. And the survey respondent needs to feel and experience an absence and elimination of social desirability bias. So this is something that is prevented in what we would describe as kind of that traditional survey. But if a randomized response format is used, a well-established statistical approach to asking questions, particularly on sensitive topics, and even if surveys can introduce random noise, which can conceal individual responses and truly protect privacy, that's how we really get at to the truth of what's happening in a culture.
Well, thank you, Jamie. I think, Anthony, these issues are, and these challenges of getting an accurate assessment are particularly important when we're concerned about toxic cultures. And we all know of examples where we looked at companies that got into trouble because of a toxic culture. Who's responsible in your mind of monitoring corporate culture and making sure that it's not toxic, but conducive to the overall performance of the company?
Yeah, well, while it is not unusual to hear that everybody in the organization is responsible for its culture, we truly believe that the ultimate accountability rests with the CEO and the top team. It is also the board of directors, particularly in publicly traded organizations, who play a really active role when there is a less culture-focused CEO. Cultures have a tendency to morph as different people with different values and beliefs join the organization, and or new leaders bring in their experiences from previous organizations. So monitoring that the company stays true to its values and beliefs should really be one of the main areas of focus for the C-suite, the executive team, and the CEO and board. Culture is really not something that is the sole responsibility of the HR function, which in many organizations, we've seen this happen. It's not exclusively their responsibility. They certainly have to be a driver and help with the implementation of change around specific behaviors. But every member of the top team has a role to play with ultimate accountability resting with the CEO or the chairman of the board at the end of the day.
So once we have a sense of where we stand and if there's some challenges, and once we have a sense of kind of who has responsibility to addressing potential cultural challenges, how do we actually do this? And Jamie, influencing human behavior is a very complicated and complex endeavor, especially when it comes to culture. So how do you fix a bad culture? What are some of the best practices to get alignments and to drive change so that you have a culture, a corporate culture that is effective in achieving the most important strategic objectives of the company?
It's a great question, and when we come in to organizations and companies, one thing we like to often say is unethical activity notwithstanding. It's not so much about a bad culture or a good culture. It's about aligning strategy to culture, as Anthony was talking about earlier. It's about ensuring that behavior matches values, that leaders are empowered to model and drive decisions, drive culture change, and that this is consistently experienced across an organization and across employee experience. One way to think about this is when a strong culture we tend to see is led with a tone at the top that reverberates to the bottom and across the organization. So Anthony talks about that leadership, that tone at the top, the accountability, but you hear the echoes of that culture at the bottom and middle of that organization, and that it matches the facts on the ground. And what we mean by that is, do people live, practice, and experience what an organization or company says they value? And by way of that, is there alignment? Is there cultural alignment across an organization?
So, Anthony, I want to come back to your comment on, the role of the CEO. So let's say you're serving on a board, and you look at the CEO, and after careful assessment, your sense is that the CEO or senior management is really part of the problem. What should we do as a board at this point? What advice would you give to company boards to address these particular challenges?
Yeah, and at risk of sounding like a self-fulfilling prophecy here, I do think having external advice on this topic is paramount. I think that being able to look from an objective perspective and see where there are potential issues within the organization around the culture and behaviors, whether that be unethical activity like Jamie talked about, or cultures that don't support ultimately the strategy. So, we're trying to drive growth in emerging markets, but, we're double down on investments in tier one markets or more mature markets. So I think that having that external view will not only give the board comfort in that they have the right advice and the right insight, it also gives us a lens into those microcultures in the organization that could be emulating the future, right? So, as Jamie talked about this, that echo from the bottom, what people are doing, how they're acting. There may be places where we want to identify, and using the idea of the metaphor of a brain scan, right, or an MRI, we want to be able to look and see where there are things that are performing well and are healthy, but also those spots where we may not be looking for, and may also cause future issues for us or put us at future risk. So I'd say long-winded way of coming around to having that unbiased, objective external advice in this case is truly paramount to the process, and I think giving the board and the management team comfort in making decisions on the future culture.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point that you make, because boards, of course, are used to getting outside perspectives on important aspects, whether it's on strategic advice, financial advice, audit services, and so forth. And I think whenever there is this concern with senior management, getting outside perspectives is hugely important. So I'm going to ask both of you. This is our last question to bring this back to where we are right now. So we're having this dramatic year and a half now behind us. Dramatic public health crisis, of course. Dramatic economic disruptions. Urgent calls for racial justice. What cultural aspects have you seen as being most resilient and most effective in dealing with these challenges? I'm going to ask Anthony first, and then I'm going to ask Jamie to kind of give her perspective as well.
Sure, I agree. I mean, I don't think there ever has been a time where we've had the confluence of so many different external impacts on organizational culture. I'd say three things, Daniel. The first is empathy. I think the cultures that have really demonstrated empathy from the top to say, we actually don't know the answer. We don't know what's happening during the pandemic, and we're going to evolve over time, and we will listen and understand and pivot based on that. The second is the agility. I think those cultures that have senior executives and senior leaders who can move from strategy to execution, and also evolve, as I was mentioning in that empathy point, evolve as we learn more from the organization and how we need to address the well-being of our workforce. And the third is transparency. I think the tone at the top, to be transparent around communication, to be vulnerable during this time. We saw a tremendous spike in engagement and connection of those organizations. And so, really none of those three topics are things that are new for organizational culture. What we found is that those during the pandemic that actually had that as a strength within their senior team were able to navigate the pandemic and other societal and economic issues that caused the roller coaster in 2020 into 2021. That also allowed us in this hockey stick to return to growth that we're seeing in so many different industry sectors now as we're edging towards the end of 2021. Jamie, what do you think?
Thank you.
I strongly agree, Anthony, about empathy, about the strength and vulnerability, about this concept of agility. And really what we have seen is organizations and companies that could pivot to meet this moment are likely to pivot to be able to meet moments to come. And when we look at those organizations, we tend to see cultures that are resilient. They have values that are stated and they mean it. They have empowered, human-centered leadership teams. And these are organizations that are anchored around diversity, equity, inclusion, a true sense of belonging, and enables organizations to not only have strong cultures, but really walk the walk.
Well, Anthony and Jamie, thank you very much for your insights on this important topic of culture, particularly in an environment where culture is more important than ever. Thank you very much for joining us today.